Hello and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue reading from The View from the Stars, an anthology of science fiction short stories by Walter M. Miller, Jr. Anybody else like me? Quiet misery in a darkened room. The clock spoke 9 times with a cold brass voice. She stood motionless, leaning against the drapes by the window, alone. The night was black, the house empty and silent. Come, Lisa, she told herself, you're not dying. She was 34, still lovely, with a slender white body and a short, rich thatch of warm red hair. She had a good, dependable husband, 3 children, and security. She had friends, hobbies, social activities. She painted mediocre pictures for her own amusement, played piano rather well, and wrote fair poetry for the university's literary quarterly. She was well read, well rounded, well informed. She loved and was loved. Then why this quiet misery? Wanting something, expecting nothing, she stared out into the darkness of the stone walled garden. The night was too quiet. A distant street lamp played in the branches of the elm, and the elm threw its shadow across another wing of the house. She watched the shadows wandering for a time. A lone car purred past in the street and was gone. A horn sounded raucously in the distance. What was wrong? 1,000 times since childhood she had felt this uneasy stirring, this crawling of the mind that called out for some unfound expression. It had been particularly strong in recent weeks. She tried to analyze. What was different about recent weeks? Events. Frank's job had sent him on the road for a month. The children were at mother's. The city council had recommended a bond issue. A drunk had strangled his wife. The university had opened its new psychophysics lab. Her art class had adjourned for the summer. Nothing there. No clue to the unreasoning, goalless urge that called like a voice crying in a mental wilderness, come, share, satisfy, express it to the fullest. Express what? Satisfy what? How? A baby deserted at birth and dying of starvation would feel terrible hunger, but if it had never tasted milk, it could not know the meaning of the hunger, nor how to ease it. I need to relate this thing to something else, to something in my own experience or in the experience of others. She had tried to satisfy the urge with the goals of other hungers: her children, her husband's lovemaking, food, drink, art, friendship, but the craving was something else, crying for its pound of unknown flesh, and there was no fulfillment. How am I different from others? She asked herself. But she was different only in the normal ways that every human being is different from the exact average. Her intelligence was high, short of genius, but superior. To a limited extent, she felt the call of creativity. Physically, she was delicately beautiful. The only peculiarities that she knew about seemed ridiculously irrelevant: a dark birthmark on her thigh, a soft fontanelle in the top of her long, narrow head, like the soft spot in an infant's cranium. Silly little differences. One big difference: the quiet misery of the unfed hunger. The scattering of big raindrops suddenly whispered on the walk and in the grass and through the foliage of the elm. A few drops splattered on the screen, spraying her face and arms with faint points of coolness. It had been oppressively hot. Now there was a chill breath in the night. Reluctantly, she closed the window. The oppression of the warm and empty house increased. She walked to the door opening into the walled garden. Ready for a lonely bed, she was wearing a negligee over nothing. Vaguely, idly, her hand fumbled at the waist knot, loosened it. The robe parted, and the fine spray of rain was delightfully cool on her skin. The garden was dark, the shadows inky, the nearest neighbor a block away. The walls screened it from prying eyes. She brushed her hands over her shoulders, the sleeves slipped down her arms. Peeled clean, feeling like a freed animal, she pressed open the screen and stepped out under the eaves to stand on the warm stone walk. The rain was rattling in the hedge and roaring softly all about her, splashing coldness about her slender calves. She hugged herself and stepped into it. The drench of icy fingers stroked her with pleasant lashes. She laughed and ran along the walk toward the elm. The drops stung her breasts, rivered her face, and coursed coldly down her sides and legs. She exulted in the rain, tried to dance, and laughed at herself. She ran. Then, tired, she threw herself down on the crisp, wet lawn, stretching her arms and legs and rolling slowly on the grass. Eyes closed, drenched and languorous, she laughed softly and played imagining games with the rain. The drops were steel-jacketed wasps zipping down out of the blackness, but she melted them with her mind, made them soft and cool and caressing. The drops took impersonal liberties with her body, and she rolled demurely to lie face down on the rain-soft grass. I am still a pale beast, she thought happily, still kin of my grandmother the ape who danced in the tree and chattered when it rained. How utterly barren life would be if I were not a pale beast. She dug her fingers into the sodden turf, bared her teeth, pressed her forehead against the ground, and growled a little animal growl. It amused her, and she laughed again. Crouching, she came up on her hands and knees, hunching low, teeth still bared. Like a cat, she hissed and pounced upon a sleeping bird, caught it, and shook it to death. Again she laughed as she lay in the grass. If Frank were to see me like this, she thought, he would put me to bed with a couple of sleeping pills and call that smug Dr. Mensley to have a look at my mind. And Dr. Mensley would check my ambivalences and my repressions and my narcissistic, voyeuristic, masochistic impulses. He would tighten my screws and readjust me to reality, fit me into a comfortable groove, and take the pale beast out of me to make me a talking doll. He had done it several times before. Thinking of Dr. Mensley, Lisa searched her vocabulary for the most savage word she could remember. She growled it aloud and felt better. The rain was slowly subsiding. A siren was wailing in the distance. The police. She giggled and imagined a headline in tomorrow's paper: Prominent socialite jailed for indecent exposure. And the story would go on. Mrs. Lisa Waverly was taken into custody by the police after neighbors reported that she was running around stark naked in her backyard. Said Mrs. Heinhofer, who called the law, it was just terrible. Looked to me like she was having fits. Mr. Heinhofer, when asked for comments, simply closed his eyes and smiled ecstatically. Lisa sighed wearily. The siren had gone away. The rain had stopped except for drippings out of the elm. She was tired, emotionally spent, yet strangely melancholy. She sat up slowly in the grass and hugged her shins. The feeling came over her gradually. Someone has been watching me. She stiffened slowly, but remained in place, letting her eyes probe about her in the shadows. If only the drippings would stop so she could listen. She peered along the hedge and along the shadows by the garden wall, toward the dark windows of the house, up toward the low-hanging mist faintly illuminated from below by street lights. She saw nothing, heard nothing. There was no movement in the night, yet the feeling lingered, even though she scoffed. If anyone is here, she thought, I'll call them gently, and if anyone appears, I'll scream so loud that Mrs. Heinhofer will hear me. Hey, she said in a low voice, but loud enough to penetrate any nearby shadows. There was no answer. She folded her arms behind her head and spoke again, quietly, sensually. Come and get me. No black monster slithered from behind the hedge to devour her. No panther sprang from the elm. No succubus congealed out of wet darkness. She giggled. Come have a bite. No bull ape came to crush her in ravenous jaws. She had only imagined the eyes upon her. She stretched lazily and picked herself up, pausing to brush off the leaves of grass pasted to her wet skin. It was over, the strange worship in the rain, and she was weary. She walked slowly toward the house. Then she heard it, a faint crackling sound, intermittent, distant. She stood poised in the black shadow of the house, listening. The crackle of paper, then a small pop, then crisp fragments dropped in the street. It was repeated at short intervals. Taking nervous, shallow breaths, she tiptoed quietly toward the stone wall of the garden. It was 6 feet high, but there was a concrete bench under the trellis. The sound was coming from over the wall. She stood crouching on the bench. Then, hiding her face behind the vines, she lifted her head to peer. A street lamp was half a block away, but she could see dimly. A man was standing across the street in the shadows, apparently waiting for a bus. He was eating peanuts out of a paper bag, tossing the shells in the street. That explained the crackling sound. She glared at him balefully from through the trellis. "I'll claw your eyes out," she thought, "if you came and peeped over my wall." "Hi," said the man. Lisa stiffened and remained motionless. It was impossible that he could see her. She was in shadow against a dark background. Had he heard her foolish babbling a moment ago? More likely he had only cleared his throat. "Hi," he said again. Her face was hidden in the dripping vines, and she could not move without rustling. She froze in place, staring. She could see little of him. Dark raincoat, dark hat, slender shadow. Was he looking toward her? She was desperately frightened. Suddenly, the man chucked the paper bag in the gutter, stepped off the curb, and came sauntering across the street toward the wall. He removed his hat, and crisp blond hair glinted in the distant streetlight. He stopped 3 yards away, smiling uncertainly at the vines. Lisa stood trembling and frozen, staring at him in horror. Strange sensations, utterly alien, passed over her in waves. There was no describing them, no understanding them. I I found you, he stammered sheepishly. Do you know what it is? I know you, she thought. You have a small scar on the back of your neck and a mole between your toes. Your eyes are blue and you have an impacted wisdom tooth, and your feet are hurting because you walked all the way out here from the university. And I'm almost old enough to be your mother. But I can't know you because I've never seen you before. Strange, isn't it? He said uncertainly. He was holding his hat in his hand and cocking his head politely. What? She whispered. He shuffled his feet and stared at them. It must be some sort of palpable biophysical energy form, analytically definable, if we had enough data. Lord knows I'm no mystic. If it exists, it's got to be mathematically definable. But why us? Horrified curiosity made her step aside and lean her arms on the wall to stare down at him. He looked up bashfully and his eyes widened slightly. Oh, oh, what? She demanded, putting on a terrible frown. You're beautiful. What do you want? She asked icily. Go away. I. He paused and closed his mouth slowly. He stared at her with narrowed eyes and touched one hand to his temple as if concentrating. For an instant, she was no longer herself. She was looking up at her own shadowy face from down in the street, looking through the eyes of a stranger who was not a stranger. She was feeling the fatigue in the weary ankles, and the nasal ache of a slight head cold, and the strange sadness in a curious heart, a sadness too akin to her own. She rocked dizzily. It was like being in two places at once, like wearing someone else's body for a moment. The feeling passed. It didn't happen, she told herself. No use denying it, he said quietly. I tried to make it go away too, but apparently we've got something unique. It would be interesting to study. Do you suppose we're related? Who are you? She choked, only half hearing his question. You know my name, he said. if you'll just take the trouble to think about it. Yours is Lisa, Lisa O'Brien, or Lisa Waverly. I'm never sure which. Sometimes it comes to me one way, sometimes the other. She swallowed hard. Her maiden name had been O'Brien. I don't know you, she snapped. His name was trying to form in her mind. She refused to allow it. The young man sighed. I'm Kenneth Greerley, if you really don't know. He stepped back a pace and lifted his hat toward his head. I I guess I better go. I see this disturbs you. I had hoped we could talk about it, but, well, good night, Mrs. Waverly. He turned and started away. Wait, she called out against her will. He stopped again. Yes? Were were you watching me while it was raining? He opened his mouth and stared thoughtfully down the street toward the light. You mean watching visually? You really are repressing this thing, aren't you? I thought you understood. He looked at her sharply, forlornly. They say the failure to communicate is the basis of all tragedy. Do you suppose in our case. What? Nothing. He shifted restlessly for a moment. Good night. Good night, she whispered many seconds after he was gone. And we'll find out what's up with Lisa Waverly and this guy next time.